Well, thank you very much for joining us for our budget special analysis. I think this is around about our 25th budget we've covered. We started when we were about 5 years old. And I would say that in terms of form, in the delivery of the budget speech and the clarity, this is one of the finest budget speeches I've heard. Very clear, not going into too many decimal details which other finance ministers invariably do. They say 1,256 lakh crore, 0.53 thousand, I mean, just unnecessary detail. That was avoided here. It's very clear, the entire budget speech. Of course, that's the form. And there are two things that we are going to discuss. What about the content? Has there been enough to boost our troubled areas of the economy? Boost our exports? Is there anything in it? Boost our investment, which the economic survey really focused on. Investment, investment, investment. Is that going to go up, which India desperately needs? And then there are a few pain points for the average person. The price of petrol and diesel are going to go up. It's not clear whether they're going up by 1 rupee or 2 rupees. Probably one, let's think positively. And for the very rich amongst us, they're going to pay more tax. But by and large, nothing really painful except petrol and diesel, and those do hurt. So, Dora, why don't you start? Couple of points, main point.
I think there is nothing revolutionary about this budget. I don't know where the resources are going to be raised. There isn't much to raise resources. If I look at the budget presented by Mr. Jaitley and the one now, there is nothing that I see which is going to help us raise significant resources except this investment, which is about 70,000-80,000 crore last year, 1 lakh crore this year. But we're talking of really big bucks, and I don't know where the big bucks are coming from. Probably the accountants know where they're coming from.
Right. I'd like to go to you on disinvestment. There's a big difference between ideological disinvestment, where you want to transfer from the public sector into private sector entrepreneurship, and strategic, where you reduce a little bit. Now they've said, one, Air India is going to continue. It was a disaster not to be able to privatize Air India or disinvest Air India. And everything else was also very slow. Now this 1,05,000 crores they're going to raise through disinvestment. How realistic is it? And is that going to improve efficiency of these different companies?
I think one big takeaway from the budget was the figure of 1.05. But yes, there could have been much greater scope. And I would rather think this was the right time to actually look at a much larger figure. But I would think that it's a prudent way of looking at it. Let's target for 1.05 and probably exceed much more and keep to the target rather than coming up with targets which will not be fulfilled. And I see this to be a pretty much realistic target, given this type of scope that is available, and specifically because she talked about strategic. I think one needs to be careful in terms of how we handle this entire disinvestment. We won't want another failure like what we have seen in the past, and therefore I think it's most important for them to be prudent in that target. And this is one of the many issues that you mentioned in the budget, where there are good points in the budget, and I mean, the notes this time went to so much, because it's actually she went on to not only talk about what has happened, but I think it was like she set certain targets, certain vision, but I think clearly certain pain points which you just mentioned have been very, very well addressed. And I think one of the biggest things that has been addressed in the budget has been liquidity. And I think liquidity has been a big issue, both the banking sector and the shadow banking sector, the NBFC. I think she has done a marvelous job in seeing to it that liquidity is infused.
That is actually a very important point. Who would like to discuss the 70,000 crores for refinancing public sector banks and then allowing NBFC pooled assets to be bought over? It's like TARP, like the American TARP, our Indian version of TARP, the American, where they try to boost the economy by taking over shaky assets.
Well, I don't know if 70,000 crores is sufficient enough.
Whether it's enough
for the bank capitalization. I don't think anyone was expecting. In fact, there was a categorical statement on disinvestment besides Air India that the government is not going to dilute its holding in public sector banks. Right. On disinvestment, I just wanted to make one comment. If you look at the trend of disinvestments in the past 2 years, it's been largely pulling out cash out of cash-rich, profitable public sector undertakings. So if a cash-rich public sector undertakings buys into another undertaking, which is listed in the Niti Aayog list of strategic sales of equity, then it's questionable whether that is really privatization.
And it weakens the public PFC and RFC were merged, and it weakens the original company because you were just removing cash from it. You could have sold it to the public, but you're just doing a swap. Right. That doesn't help.
And if you look at it, the outlays of those, if they are not deployed for capital expenditure, but they are deployed for meeting your revenue and interest obligations, then you're looking at the quality of disinvestment not yielding what we call it as yield that you'll typically get from privatization of large government undertakings.
Okay, let me do an experiment. I'd just like to go through each one of you and ask you for 2 real positive highlights, headlines in this, and 2 worrying aspects or negatives. Dr. Trayan, I know you should be operating on somebody right now, but thank you for coming.
I hope I will be soon, if you let me go. But the main thing is that I was surprised that there was no real mention of health, except that we got some custom duty relief on kidney dialyzers. So, see, on one hand, what we are looking at, facing today is job creation we need.
Right.
We need to operationalize Ayushman so that those 50 crore people...
I was going to ask you about that, yes.
50 crore people can get
this massive insurance scheme, which was the highlight of last year's budget.
Right.
Very low allocation for it last year, and they said they're going to increase it. Not even mentioned this year.
That's
a
the
great
whole thing.
idea, but
at
did that
the beginning,
disappoint you?
why I felt there was a big gap she could have filled here was that in the beginning of those 5 years, they promised that the healthcare allocation will go up from 1.1 to 2.5% progressively in the next 5 years. That was the promise of the first budget. We are nowhere near this. In fact, we have not moved much. And on the other hand, the aspirations of delivering healthcare to 50 crore people is real. And
I mean, it's a great
Prime
idea,
Minister,
great target, but implementation.
So the Prime Minister actually reiterated it in his speech again. So the point is, how is the financing going to come? Because this scheme involves everybody, the NGOs, the government sector, the private sector.
We should make it very clear, the scheme you're talking about is the government will provide health insurance to 50 crore people. That's 500 million people, health insurance.
Right.
Right.
So it's a great scheme. I think it's a real game changer, and we all actually full-heartedly actually support it. But the operationalization, how it will, the budget will come and all that, could have been made clear here. That was my expectation, that it would be made clear.
So that's one disappointment.
So yeah, but the other thing is that unless we create this infrastructure and the skilling and the attendant medical schools and paramedical schools and all that, it's a great opportunity to provide at least 5 to 9 million jobs in the next 5 years in the healthcare sector.
Purely in the healthcare sector.
For every bed you create, there is direct employment of 4 to 6 people and an indirect of about 10 to 12 people who are in the ancillary industry. So this is a very important sort of sector, second only to agriculture. So if we were, so maybe clarity will come now. One of the things is what's in the annexures. Maybe there are some things in the annexures.
But it's such an important area. 500 million people being insured, that they must come in the speech if there's something big being done.
Right.
So that's a disappointment. How about you, Sachin?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me was the focus on the startups. I think the startups have been bleeding. One of the major things which they've announced this time is that there'll be no scrutiny on the startups going forward, and even for the pending scrutinies, they'll probably they've set up a committee to look into it. I think that's where the money is coming in. In fact, if you're looking at FDI, that's where the money is coming in, and if they ease out the problems which the startups were facing.
Angel tax.
Yes, that angel tax. Well, The phrase comes
Explain that
from
to us.
people where money is put in more than the valuation of the company, looking at the future valuation. That's why they are called angel tax investors.
Right.
And therefore, if they are promoted, and that's why the money will come from, if they are given that leeway or that headway, I think that's going to help.
So they're not going to question the valuation anymore.
Absolutely.
Those valuations are done based on 10-year projections, Excel sheets done by people like Dorab. They make these fantasy Excel sheets. And
Well, I'll take part of the blame
now
for that,
all
but
Dorab's
yes,
fantasies will be accepted by the tax.
I hope so.
Well, that's worrying. So, good.
Yeah.
One or two good points and one or two worrying.
So I just hope that, this issue that's being discussed for the past, that gets settled too. So they don't rake up just the past also.
Yes, they did mention that they will clear all the past, but
Yes,
one
but
thing is to mention it, one thing is to do
What
it.
she announced was that now even the past, the officer will have to take approvals from the commissioner, and I think that will get some kind of balancing act. I'm not too hopeful.
Officer and commissioner always together, that's not a independent...
So the
So
past
that's a
litigation-
worrying, again, implementation. But startups is a very important area for India.
Yeah.
So something is done.
Absolutely. And the other important thing that I thought was the 25% rate, corporate tax rate, that will be available to companies having turnover less than 400 crores and covering almost 97% of the companies. That, to my mind, was very big. It was an ask that you
Yeah,
should
but
increase
the point
that.
is 97% in number. But in terms of value of their output, it must
to the tax.
20% of the tax.
Probably not even 20%.
Not even 20%. So it's a bit unfair to say 97%. All the small guys are getting it, but the big guys, no change.
It's also got to do with reducing the compliances and the impact that has on these companies. Probably that's the thing.
Right. You think that's a positive?
That's
Any
a positive.
worries?
Sorry?
Worry?
Worry, I think there was no clear roadmap on the direct taxes code. There was a lot of talk about the direct tax code coming in, but there was nothing in the speech that I heard about the direct tax code.
I would say it's a very well calibrated budget, and it would definitely enthuse infrastructure industry also. From cement sector's point of view, I would like to say that yes, the way government has put focus on infrastructure, more particularly on roads, on housing, then on railways, and government this time has been able to say what's their future path. Say like for railways, they have talked about 2030, how much expenditure would be made. They have talked about dedicated freight corridor. Then they have talked about housing. Yes, then particularly affordable housing by way of.
But
say,
by 2030, will we remember this budget?
we would remember.
We're so far away.
Yes, but planning is required, and for future.
I did notice that power sector, all the share prices are plummeted.
Okay, and then the way now solar power and electric vehicles are being promoted, so that fosters.
Electric vehicles are very big.
So
Worries?
So that augurs well for the over clean technology, and then the way government has now first time has come out, public-private partnership even at the village level also, and they are saying now they would be growing bamboos etc. to create power. So like from Annadata to Urja Data. But the worries is that maybe they should have come out with a clear roadmap that how the monies would be coming in and how this infrastructure expenditure would be met with.
How will you get the money? That's the worry. Okay,
I think there are several positives, particularly from an FDI standpoint. So there are some sectors that are foreign direct investment. Sorry, aviation.
India, we love anagrams.
We love
FDI, SSP, CSSP.
CSS.
Sometimes
So I
I
think-
wonder if she knew what it was.
Yeah.
Okay.
The three sectors that were looking out for liberalization were aviation, insurance intermediaries, and the single brand retail, outsourcing.
I want to ask you on aviation.
Yeah.
It's a sector, whole sector's in trouble.
Correct.
We've seen the wonderful Jet Airways deep in trouble. We saw Kingfisher earlier going down. Was there anything for that sector? We are going to be leasing planes and financing planes externally, but what
Yeah.
about India? What's
I don't know if the
gain for
entire
there?
sector is in trouble. I mean,
Yeah.
barring an outlier Jet Airways example for its own problems, I think the sector is doing phenomenally well. If you look at the economic survey, the last 3-year trends on aviation, the increase in traffic is phenomenal.
No, that's fine, but
Yeah.
in the last 6 months, the costs and losses have increased in every airline. So the Japanese have a philosophy that when any one company goes down, don't touch it. But if an entire sector is in trouble, profits are going down, heading towards, there should be something. Was there anything for the aviation sector here?
Nothing really in particular. In fact, one of the demands of the aviation industry was a liberal customs tariff on aviation fuel, which is directly imported. In fact, early in the year when there were customs levies on non-essential goods, aviation fuel also got added to that. So there's really nothing for the aviation sector.
Okay, we've got Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, one of my favorite people to ask about the budget, because one thing you get from Ms. Shaw, you get the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Very often, and I've said this budget after budget for 20 years, in the ad breaks, everybody says shit budget. Then on air, they say 9.5 out of 10. You don't get that from Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw. Ma'am, your top two positives and two worries or negatives.
So my top two positives were definitely the startup sector, which I think got a lot of support and lot of shocks from the government, and I think that is very, very good. The other sector that got a lot of mention was, of course, the rural economy, and I just wrote an article today, and many of these things have been reflected in the budget, so I was very happy to see that, because, they talked about creating 10,000 FPOs and 75,000 rural agri entrepreneurs, which is exactly what I felt should be the way to look at, building a rural economy, and of course the rural infra to connect the rural economy with the urban market. So those were my top two kind of positives. But, I was very disappointed with the government falling short of the corporate tax reduction. For instance, the finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, said that, I'm going to, expand this 25% corporate tax to 400 crore income companies, and she said this covers 99.3% of companies, and only 0.7% are out of this. Why leave out the 0.7%? I mean, I felt that this was going to be a very important signal for investors, for corporate India, and for the capital markets. So I think this would have moved the needle. I think this would have really moved that virtuous cycle that we're talking about, and I think we fell short of it. So I think, I always worry that we don't really take advantage of the budget to make some very important, bold announcements, and we fall short of it. Even we heard things like, the GST has been a great reform, and although it has been a very complex and difficult reform to roll out, but now it's sort of gaining pace. Now, I would have liked to have seen some more definite news on how they are further simplifying GST. Maybe it's not for the budget, but I think the budget could have actually said that they are doing away with the 28% GST rate altogether. Things like that. Then, the healthcare was talked about in terms of Ayushman Bharat, but they never really talked about what else are they going to do to really bolster this particular sector. This sector needs actually a doubling of spend. I didn't hear that. Education, they only talked about the 400 crore for world-class institutes, which is neither here nor there. 400 crores is not where we need to be in terms of our education policy or our education spend. We spend 3% of GDP on education. This should be doubled if we really want to, become a very, very knowledge-led economy. On the other hand, and skill-led economy. On the other hand, I was happy to see the focus on research and development. So of course, I'd like to see what is the allocation of spend on R&D, because it's one thing to talk about all the wonderful things that they want to do. So I just think that, as she was going through the budget, I was very encouraged, very optimistic. I was saying, is this the first time I'm going to give an 8 on 10 for this budget? And by the end of it, I felt, no, I can't give it 8 on 10.
Right. One of the things, sorry, we've just lost you.
Yeah. Hello? Hello?
Okay. We'll just come back to you. We're just fixing the audio. There's a bit of a problem there. Mamta Dubey, a couple of good points and bad points.
So the good points, I think people have mentioned at the sectoral level, there was some intriguing ideas. My concern is that at the fundamental level, the budget to me was more disappointing. One is if you look at protectionism. For many years in the 90s and 2000s, we would look forward to new budgets saying they're going to cut duty rates, they're going to open things up. The overall level of protectionism will go down. But under the Modi government, every year we have to look forward to duty rates being increased. And this is in an environment of increasing protectionism. And this goes against what the government's own economic survey said, which is that in an environment of higher protectionism, we should globalize and take advantage of opportunities.
Right.
But that's not what we see happening here. The second disappointment is to do with jobs. Something, of course, is a very fundamental issue. And if you look at the sunrise sectors that the government is encouraging, they are all capital intensive. This is not where the jobs are going to come from. Artificial intelligence is not going to generate millions of jobs directly. Indirectly is a different story. You need people to make small and simple items in very large numbers, as happens in China and Vietnam. And for that, we don't see anything. So we're subsidizing capital and taxing labor, which is the wrong way to go about it.
Right. I just wanted to ask you, I think a point raised by Amitabh Dubey is that very often the economic survey, and we almost see it every year, says one thing and the budget doesn't do anything of that sort. And this time in particular, they talked about, the economic survey talked about investment, the virtuous cycle. She mentioned virtuous cycle, but is this budget going to improve investment?
So Prannoy, you referred in the beginning to the fact that you started covering this 25 years ago. And I think the one part that came in from the past is source of capital being foreign investment. And they started bringing it in. But in this speech, what we hear is something where the finance minister is playing incremental, she's playing safe. Unlike what happened 25 years ago.
Right.
Why do I say incremental and safe? Because she talked about aviation, but as you correctly said, aviation only meant MRO, or maintenance, repair, overhaul facilities, and you don't need more than 2 or 3 in a country. Right. But there was no mention of e-commerce, something that requires a lot of emphasis to come in for regulations to be stable.
It's a huge area.
Correct. I think the good point was that she talked about the fact that we are going to relook at how we get the flows of funds into infrastructure over the next 5 years. And we're going to set up a committee, we're going to look at that. So that part was a very helpful statement. But
it always terrifies me when they set up a committee.
But the question is going to be, is there something at this moment that we know and understand that's going to address the issue? I don't think we do. But at least they're talking about possible roadmap. We didn't hear of a roadmap on taxes. As Vikram said, there is a direct tax code which is under development. She talked of simplification and transparency, but there's no roadmap which tells us how we're going to get a more moderate tax regime.
I think in fact in the first budget speech of this government, Arun Jaitley said we're going to be reducing taxes to hit it, but we are not.
We haven't reached
we've lost our way there.
Yep.
So one of the things that's not really gotten picked up, there's a very interesting tweak that they've done. So on the equity side, I completely agree with Gokul. I think all the attempt has been incremental. So aviation opened up, media opened up a little bit, single brand retail, insurance intermediaries. So that's incremental. But what she also mentioned was foreign portfolio investment in debt. And debt is where we need a lot more coming in of capital into the economy. That piece, if it becomes easier for foreign portfolio investors to invest into debt for this country, I think that's a very interesting piece.
That's interesting, yes.
And this perhaps follows the Khan Committee report, which was released by the RBI, and this is perhaps deriving its origin from there. And if that happens, I think that can unleash significant funding into the economy on the investment side. The other thing that was important to note, So while I agree that committees are normally terrifying, but the fact that they've set a target for infra spending both in the public sector and in the private sector, I think that's interesting. So REITs and InvITs, which are vehicles which will be able to get the necessary 8 to 10% kind of funding into the economy.
Now you're speaking in Greek.
So
the average viewer.
real estate investment trusts and infrastructure investment trusts, which attract that kind of capital, I think that's also a very interesting move. So from a capital raise standpoint, I think these two things stood out for me.
Will this give a boost to the real estate sector, which is in terrible shape?
So infrastructure more clearly. I'm not sure how much real estate investment trusts will come up. So I'm not. So affordable housing, yes, on the tax side, but this whole real estate investment trust investments, I'm not entirely sure.
Okay. We just got Kiran Mazumdar back on. Sorry to have lost you. Just the basic overall point of view, is this going to boost, this budget going to boost confidence, boost investment, which the economic survey talks made such an important issue? Investment, investment, investment. And secondly, healthcare. I see the share price of healthcare companies have gone down. But first, the overall, will it boost confidence? Oh, we've lost the line again. Chalo, at least I was on air. Come on.
Okay, the two things that to me are quite different from what everybody else here was talking about. One was the attention that was paid to self-help groups. Women are 48% of the population, and they're normally neglected in most budgets. This was the first time I've heard that something specific was, actually promised. And taking off from there, the access to the increase in the amount of loan given to one member of a self-help group under the Mudra scheme.
Yes.
Now, I think this is very good because as of now, about 60 to 70% of unorganized labor are women in this country. Data which is very often ignored, especially in the big budget, speeches, etc. What disappointed me was two things. As Dr. Trehan said, the attention to health, and I would like to have heard more convergence between the new economic policy and skilling. Because if you're talking about increasing jobs, you also have to increase